coming out from everything is this central law of polarities. It can also be called opposites, can't it? It can be called opposites because that's how they appear to be.
Yes.
But in reality, most things are working together, or they're on a scale. So we say hot and cold as an example, but there's a scale, isn't there? Suddenly you tip over into cold and suddenly you tip over into warm. There's the scale of temperature. So even though we say opposites, they're really, like you said about the hemispheres, they work together. Something about the word opposite kind of leads to the idea of opposition, doesn't it? And this has caused a lot of problems throughout human history because they have fallen into opposition. And a lot of polarities, poles end up in conflict rather than understanding that there's something to be said from both, or something to be done, or some function that's vital from both angles. So yeah, it's to chase down that core perception and stay with it long enough that later you then look out from it and you start seeing it everywhere. One of the first things I found I had, when I presented this subject here in Brazil, is to clarify the word negative, because when you talk about polarities, you say
yes.
positive, negative. Of course, you're talking about energy and the aura and force. When people hear the word negative, what do they think? They think you're talking about something bad, right? So it's quite unfortunate that the same word, negative, has these two different connotations. One is to do with negative result, like you failed, or a negative energy, something bad. But in the context of polarities, it's talking about the receptive, the passive, the receiving, the softening, the slowing down polarity one way or another. And that is absolutely as essential as the positive polarity. There's no superiority between either of these two poles.
Yeah. Very good point, because in a world where, so much is plastic and artificial, one of the things that I love about these sorts of laws is that humans didn't create them. They've been there since the beginning of the universe, let alone the beginning of time. And, you think of when you're awake and you're vertical and you're getting around doing things, and then when you go to sleep, unless you're a horse or a bat hanging upside down, you go into this horizontal position. But it's two completely different states. And you would put negative state with a sleep, because that's when the body heals and energizes itself. I just came across an interesting thing the other day where Francis Crick, of the famous Watson and Crick duo, team of two, there's another whole thing about discoveries made by two people working together. For the rest of his life, he was really fascinated in studying the brain. And a few years ago, he published a paper from his research results, which stated that when we're asleep, what the brain does is it empties out all the rubbish and all the unuseful information and experience that's collected during the day. Whereas when you're vertical, it's doing the opposite, isn't it? It's gathering, it's bringing in, it's experiencing, and then there's a process when you go into that horizontal state. So there's a positive and a negative state. And as you say, it doesn't have that connotation on it. And of course, you talk about hot and cold. If you're in the desert and it's hot, a cold bath would be nice. But if you're up in Norway, where they have all that thermal activity, they have all these hot geothermal pools, because when you're in cold environments, it's nice to get into it to warm up. So positive or negative is totally relevant and applicable to the particular situation and what's needed.
Yeah, one of the things I find striking in this subject is almost all the religious symbols, whether you're talking about a cross, or you're talking about the seal of Solomon, the Star of David, or you're talking about the yin-yang symbol, have these two polarities in them. But again, not other description, other terminology, other names, so we don't look and immediately see. But the cross was used by the American Indians, by the Celts, by different peoples around the planet. And it very simply shows the vertical vector, which is the positive bar, and the horizontal vector, which, as you say, when we sleep, we're forced to comply with the law.
Yes.
We literally close off, because that's an example, isn't it? Open and close. So we literally close off, we go into the slowed down negative state of the horizontal bar. But the Star of David also is showing two triangles
Yes.
locked into each other, and how that's a particular aspect of this law, right? Because you have growth and you have decomposition.
Yes.
It's part of how nature works. And again, if we understood that, maybe we would get some more natural balance to do with being able to let things go, to be able to shed things, to drop things, because it's part of the falling away of life. But one of the ones that's most fascinating is the yin yang symbol, because what I love about the yin yang symbol is that two things. One is that it's showing something in movement. It's just a static moment. When you see a picture, it's a static moment. But the other thing is the dot inside each of the areas, because inside the black area there's a white dot, and inside the white there's a black dot. And there's different levels to that understanding. But one of them is that you do get the other polarity inside what seems to be the one polarity. So as an example, the mouth is, it seems like a receptive polarity because you put food and drink and, we take in through the mouth. But inside that polarity, you would say the black, the negative polarity, you got the tongue. And as the Maori knows of the New Zealand, they use the tongue in the haka, right? They put the tongue out. And of course we communicate, we talk, and the tongue's very active inside that otherwise passive polarity. And this is where one of the things, there can be a confusion when you start trying to understand polarities. You think, well, how come if it's negative, it's got this positive bit inside it? Let's say the palm of the hand. In terms of shape, it's a negative polarity because it's receptive, it holds, the shape of it is more roundish compared to the fingers, which are, they go to grab and they point, they're more flexible, active, dynamic part. And the quantity of them compared to the singular palm is also a clue. Yeah. But inside the palm, inside that negative polarity, you got the lines.
Yeah.
So there's always things within things, it makes it just that much more fascinating, but can be confusing, but helps to understand why things are not easy to totally classify and leave at that point. There's often another nuance inside.
And it's such an important point because, as you mentioned before about the idea of that's attached to polarities of this law of duality is opposites, and it's not really accurate because the yin and yang symbol, you have one within the other. So you talk about hands, they have their own polarities. So you have a negative polarity and a positive polarity. So, they're more, obviously our hand, because the human is an energized system, therefore more than just picking up bits of fruit and banging nails in with a hammer. They have a whole other level of purpose. And that's often why it's used in symbology with the two hands, because the word I meant to put in that's better than opposite is adjacent. It's two things adjacent to each other or working in conjunction. They're not really opposite, and that's why there's been so much conflict and trouble in history where people see, and you mentioned religion, they see the way the creative powers manifest in the world as two different complementary natures, and a lot of people say this is the true way, and you're not, we'll kill you, and vice versa, and you get war and conflict. So it's also really important to have a deeper understanding about these polarities, to be able to work things out, and to, all arguments and disagreements come out of two different points of view. And, we've all had that experience, especially in relationships, where when you actually have a discussion and go back and forth, you start to see the truth of how it's just two different points of view. The actual issue or principle at play, both people actually agree upon once you get there.